I'd like to thank the committee for its interest in this important issue. In this public setting, I will do my best to shed light within the limits imposed by my professional obligations, such as protecting the confidentiality of sources. Cette présentation durera environ 15 minutes, mais après, je serai prête à répondre à vos questions, soit en français, soit en anglais. A little bit of background. I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 1994. I've had 5 overseas assignments in Sri Lanka, Russia, the Palestinian territories, Afghanistan, and now in Washington, D.C. Afghanistan was therefore my second Islamic posting and third insurgency. I spent 17 months in Afghanistan, first as a senior DFATE representative at the Provincial Reconstruction Team, or PRT, in Kandahar, and then for over a year at the Canadian Embassy in Kabul as the head of the political section and chargé d'affaires, that is, the acting ambassador. In these capacities, I was responsible for a large number of issues, including getting additional Afghan police and soldiers to Kandahar to relieve Canadian forces, development issues, counter-narcotics, coordination with our NATO allies, the UN and the Afghan government, and security and intelligence files. Detainees was only one of about 15 major issues that I worked on. My primary focus was on improving the effectiveness of our efforts so that we had a better chance of achieving our goals. I volunteered to go to Afghanistan. Canada's objectives are noble: to help bring peace, prosperity, and hope to Afghans after 30 years of war and the repressions of the Taliban. I'd like to start with 2 general comments. First, Afghanistan was an extraordinarily difficult environment. Canada had not fought a war since the Korean War 50 years earlier, and had not fought a counterinsurgency since the Boer War 100 years ago. Insurgencies are the most complicated, demanding, and subtle of wars. There are vital geopolitical and security interests at play in Afghanistan. Kandahar is the most important province in the whole country, and, most important, lives are on the line. Canadian lives and also Afghan lives. Afghanistan is not some bureaucratic exercise. It was therefore critical that we approach this daunting challenge with seriousness and also humility, and with a willingness to listen, to learn, and to adjust. Second, I was very proud to have served in Afghanistan alongside the courageous and professional men and women of the Canadian forces, including Canada's military police. The focus of our attention, in my view, should not be on those who obeyed their chain of command, which soldiers are obliged to do. Instead, any responsibility for Canada's practices toward detainees lies, in my view, with the senior military officers, senior civilian officials, and the lawyers who developed the legal framework, designed the policies and practices, and then ordered that they be implemented. What was the nature of our detainee system in Kandahar? Perhaps a good place to start is to compare our practices to those of our principal NATO allies in southern Afghanistan, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. Excuse me. What we were doing differed in 5 crucial respects. First, we took and transferred far more detainees. As of May 2007, Canada had transferred to the Afghan authorities 6 times as many detainees as the British, who were conducting military operations just as aggressive as ours and had twice as many troops in theatre. And we had transferred 20 times as many detainees as the Dutch. Second, we did not monitor our own detainees after their transfer. Again, unlike the British and Dutch, Canada's Memorandum of Understanding on Detainees, signed by General Rick Hillier in December 2005, had no provision for our own officials to follow up on what happened to our detainees after they were handed to the Afghan Intelligence Service, the NDS, National Directorate of Security. Instead, our detainee system relied upon 2 human rights groups to monitor the well-being of detainees after transfer: the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, or AIHRC, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Unfortunately, the AIHRC had very limited capacity, and in Kandahar were not allowed into the NDS prisons. So for the purposes of monitoring our detainees, they unfortunately were quite useless. The Red Cross is a very professional and effective organization. However, they were also no good for us as monitors. Once a detainee had been transferred to Afghan custody, the Red Cross, under their rules, could only inform the Afghan authorities about abuse. Under those strict rules, they are not permitted to tell Canada. The third important difference is that, again, unlike the Dutch and British, Canada was extremely slow to inform the Red Cross when we had transferred a detainee to the Afghans. The Canadian Forces leadership created a very peculiar 6-step process. Canadian military police in Kandahar had informed the Canadian Forces Command Element at Kandahar Airfield, who in turn informed Canadian Expeditionary Forces Command, or CEFCOM, in Ottawa. CEFCOM would eventually inform the Canadian Embassy in Geneva, who then informed Red Cross headquarters in Geneva, which finally was able to notify the Red Cross mission in Kandahar. This process took days, weeks, or in some cases up to 2 months. The Dutch and British military, by contrast, had a one-step process. They simply notified the Red Cross office in Kandahar directly. The Dutch did so immediately upon detaining an Afghan, and the British within 24 hours. In other words, during the critical days after the detainee was first transferred to the Afghan intelligence service, nobody was able to monitor them. Canada had decided that Canadians would not monitor. The AIHRC could not do so because they had very weak capacity and were not allowed into NDS jails. And the Red Cross in practice could not do so either because we did not inform them until days, weeks, or months after we had handed over the detainee. During those crucial first days, what happened to our detainees? According to a number of reliable sources, they were tortured. The most common forms of torture were beatings, whipping with power cables, and the use of electricity. Also common was sleep deprivation, use of temperature extremes, the use of knives and open flames, and sexual abuse, that is, rape. Torture might be limited to the first days, or it could go on for months. According to our information, the likelihood is that all the Afghans we handed over were tortured. For interrogators in Kandahar, it was a standard operating procedure. A fourth difference between us and the British and Dutch was our unusually poor record keeping. This had serious consequences. When the Red Cross was finally informed that we had transferred a detainee, not only had a lot of time passed, but the information the Canadian Forces had taken was so limited that the Red Cross was often unable even to locate our detainees. Another consequence was that we ourselves did not know about the fate of a given detainee after transfer. Was he still in detention? Had he been released? Had he been transferred to a third party? Had he died under torture or been executed? We had no idea. Once Canada did sign a new Memorandum of Understanding on 3rd May 2007, we tried to go back to figure out what had happened to the large number of Afghans we had already transferred. However, our records were so poor that the task was physically impossible. Excuse me. I'll offer a concrete example. In June 2006, an Afghan woman came to the PRT in Kandahar. She had 3 young children with her, including an infant of 6 or 8 months who was listless and visibly sick. The woman's name was Fatima. It was, in my view, an act of considerable courage for her to pass through checkpoints to a heavily fortified compound to talk to a foreigner. Her husband, Bismillah, was a taxi driver. One day he had gone to work but had never come home. Fatima came to the PRT to ask if Canada had detained him. I tried to answer her question, but Canadian records were so hopeless that I was unable to. The final difference, which is a very important one, is that Canada, unlike the UK and Netherlands, cloaked our detainee practices in extreme secrecy. The Dutch government immediately informed the Dutch Parliament as soon as a detainee had been taken. The Dutch also provided their Parliament with extremely detailed reporting on every stage of detention and transfer, and on the results of monitoring after transfer. The UK has also announced publicly the number of their detainees. The Canadian Forces, by contrast, refused to reveal even the number of detainees they have taken, claiming this would violate operational security. When the Red Cross wanted to engage on detainee issues, for 3 months the Canadian Forces in Kandahar wouldn't even take their phone calls. The same thing happened to the NATO ISAF command in Kabul, who had responsibilities to report detainee numbers to Brussels, but were told, "We know what you want, but we won't tell you." Frankly, the operational security argument makes no sense to me. If we go into a village and take away 3 Afghans, everyone in the village knows exactly who we have taken. In practice, the information was being concealed, not from the Taliban, but from NATO ISAF, the Red Cross, and the Canadian public. To recap, Canada took far more detainees than the British and Dutch. Unlike our NATO allies, we conducted no monitoring. Instead of hours, we took days, weeks, or months to notify the Red Cross, which meant nobody else could monitor. We kept hopeless records, and apparently to prevent any scrutiny, the Canadian Forces leadership concealed all this behind walls of secrecy.